The following content has been provided by RWTH Aachen University.
All right, good morning everybody, and welcome back to DIS1. Today we're going to talk about controlled experiments mostly. As you remember, we were going through lots of evaluation techniques, and we'll be taking a look at two of those that we kind of outsourced beyond this overview because they take a little more in-depth discussion, so they will be talked about after that, GOMS and also interface efficiency. As a quick review, you may remember that we talked about lots of evaluation techniques last week. We talked about literature review, cognitive walkthrough, heuristic evaluation, and model-based evaluation on the side where you don't need users to be involved. And we discussed techniques to do with users, which were model extraction, silent observation, think aloud, constructive interaction, and retrospective testing. And then we barely started on controlled experiments as the quantitative method when evaluating with users. So before we dive in, just a quick review to help you refresh your minds. Could someone explain to me how do some of those techniques without users work? Literature review, cognitive walkthrough. You could pick any of those that you remember how they work. So Victor, you look very refreshed. What about it? Any thoughts on the techniques evaluating without users? You got the free pick.
Could you repeat the question probably?
Yeah, just can you explain briefly any of those techniques? You can pick which one you want.
Okay, I would like to pick think aloud, E7.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm not mistaken, this technique lets us to hear the whole user experience that the user goes through. Mm-hmm. So, and we can't change anything, we just listen, and yeah, basically we'll kind of go into the brain and hear what's going on there.
That's right, you go right into the brain. In fact, this right-hand side has a good way to remember it, because E5, E6, E7, and E8 basically sort of build on top of each other, right? They get more and more disclosure of what's going on. So with that in mind, maybe Marta, you want to take a stab at the other techniques there in the qualitative section?
Yeah, for example, about constructive interaction, it was a bit better than think aloud because it was about cooperative between two partners, and the conversation were much normal, and yeah, so it was a kind of a conversation between students and the teacher. And,
exactly. Yeah. So you could just do it with two random users that use the system together as a team, or you could sort of pick consciously somebody who doesn't know the system so well and somebody who knows the system a little better, and then have that student-teacher kind of observation and those dynamics in the group. So you learn both about a beginner and a sort of intermediate user as they use the system. Right, and that kind of extends on the think aloud method. Similarly, maybe Aparna, you want to take a stab at some of those other qualitative methods?
Yeah, so model extraction is basically you just show some of the screens of your user interface maybe, and you ask the users what they understand from this. Do they know where to click to go to the next screen? And you try to check if your model basically makes sense to the user.
Mm-hmm. What's important to understand about model extraction is you're not giving people a task yet, right? You're just really asking them, explain this UI to me. And that is sort of the difference to silent observation, which is then just having a task, watching that person without them talking or you talking really, but they do go through a task that you gave them. All right, and so that kind of covers almost all of those qualitative methods. We got retrospective testing left.
I think it was like talking afterwards about what you found out. So the engineer says to the user, okay, so why did you do this? And then the user reflects and thinks, oh, maybe that wasn't that good idea. So he basically just says, oh, maybe I made a mistake and that would be better, or I thought about clicking that button, but it was too small, or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. And an important part of that is this only really works well if you have a recording, right? If you captured the session, so you go over that session together afterwards. You can also do it from memory, but that's usually tough because oftentimes people won't remember what they did in that moment when they were interacting. So it's often important to do that while you are actually, looking at a video of the interaction together. Okay, so that covers the qualitative ones, and then let's briefly talk about the ones evaluating without users, because we went through those as well. So any of those? Tejaswini, maybe you can pick one from the first stack.
Yeah, so we had the cognitive walkthrough, which was to judge the ability for users to learn, and it usually requires an HCI expert and an interface and task description. So I think it takes time because for each task you need to go through all the steps, like what is the goal, what is the action. So I think this was the time consuming evaluation technique.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you picked the maybe, well, not the most complicated one, but one of the more complex ones to do, since you really need to have a lot of things away. You don't necessarily need a working prototype, but you can just work from an interface specification that says how the prototype would behave, because you're doing all this in a kind of simulated fashion anyway, right? You sit down as an HCI expert and you go through step by step, with the user trying, what the user need to know to do this task, and can we reasonably assume that they have this knowledge at this point. All right, that's cognitive walkthrough. Then literature review is kind of easy, right? You review literature, surprise, surprise, and look for other work, especially in research journals, but also in industry journals, to see if somebody already looked at that question that you're trying to explore. And we got heuristic evaluation left. What's that about?
Yeah, so I think it was you go through every step of your product, the thing you want to evaluate, and check if the rules, the guidelines are still followed.
Yes, exactly. So you got a set of guidelines, rules, interface design rules, and you check against that for each step or each sort of facet or screen of your interface. Exactly. All right, and then we get into model-based evaluation, which we'll talk about in detail today. So great. And then on to controlled experiments. That's the last of the 10 methods that we're going to bring up here. And this is where we move from qualitative to quantitative. Remember, that means that we are now interested in numerical results, right? We're trying to capture actually, yay, another person joined the video feed. Thank you, Annika. I don't need to talk to the little black squares all the time. Another, so we have another method here that looks at where you can measure stuff. You can actually determine numbers in the end, right, of what's going on, rather than getting qualitative insights. And there's a big tendency, especially among engineers, to dismiss qualitative stuff as, oh, that's kind of like, the fuzzy stuff that doesn't really mean anything. And be careful not to fall into that trap, right? Because qualitative findings, like just asking users, was there anything peculiar about the interaction, anything that sort of bugged you? And they give you, completely free text answers. You record them, you go over them, you draw insights out of that. That's super valuable, right? Most of the practical user testing you will do in industry, especially, will be qualitative. You won't be doing measurements of reaction times, execution times or stuff like this most of the time. Okay, but when you go quantitative, you dive into the wonderful world of statistics and experiments. And we talked about that. We want to basically, in this case, study whether changing one thing in your system changes something else predictably, right? That's kind of the goal. Remember that correlation doesn't imply causality, right? We talked about gaming time per week and typing speed. There could be all sorts of other reasons why two things are correlated, not necessarily one is causing the other. That's important to understand. People in politics love to mess that up to make statistics, say what they want them to say. But we're scientists, so we're not going to fall for that. And we do a controlled experiment to verify something that we wanted to, that we've observed, that we think we see a correlation, so we want to figure that out. Now, what we also briefly talked about were the basic experimental designs, and that's where we kind of like, left off last time. Just as a reminder, we got the between groups thing where one half of the user base does the one condition and the other half of the user base does the other condition, and nobody does both. Or if you have more than two conditions, which is easily possible, then you split up your user base in that many groups that every group only does one condition of the experiment. And we got the session in which every user does every condition. So if you had two things to test, then you have two different devices to compare. Every user tries out both of them, one after the other. And we looked at some of the advantages of going for one or the other here and some of the disadvantages. And one of the big things within groups is, of course, it's nice if you can do it because you only need half the users, right? You get much more data. You don't need to find as many people. But there's this big thing also, there's this other advantage that you are canceling out to a certain degree individual differences, right? If you've got a Dumbo in your group and he does only one condition, then he's going to skew your results. But if he does both conditions, then it kind of cancels itself out a bit. Doesn't work if the group is too heterogeneous, then the noise will take over and you won't see your effects clearly anymore. Not because the means of your results are different, but the variance are going to be too broad. The Gaussian curves get too flat. But it can certainly help. But there's a big thing about learning effects, right? When people have to, in this simplest possible way, you give them a maze on the screen and they're supposed to solve it first by using their mouse to steer a cursor and then using their keyboard to steer a cursor, and it's the same maze in both conditions. Right? They're always going to be faster in the second condition, obviously, right? Because they know the maze by that time. The first time they need to figure it out, second time they're just going to retrace their steps. So we need to fix that. And there's a couple of ways we can do this. We call this effect, this problem with the order effect, right? The effect that the order of experiments or the order of conditions for a user in an experiment has. So we have two fundamental kinds of effects. The first one is clear. It's the one that I just explained with the maze, right? So if you do one treatment or one condition or one level of the independent variable, that's just all the same thing, just statistics speak to confuse you. And then we do the second one. This order in which we do that, in which we order the independent variable conditions, can have an effect on the dependent variable. The first one is the learning effect with the maze, where people get better as the experiment goes on. In the later conditions, they're better than in the earlier ones. And that there's an opposite one as well. If you, for example, ask people to, climb a 10-foot wall and you try it out with two kind of different sets of equipment, and they first use equipment A and then equipment B right after that, they're going to be tired by the time they use equipment B. So they're going to perform worse. But it's not because of the equipment, it's because of the order. So there's a couple obvious fixes to that, right? First of all, you can just let people take a break. This can help against the fatigue effect for sure. If you're tiring people out, then you give them a break. Maybe even they come back the next day for the other condition, right? Or after a week, whatever. How much tiredness you have induced. And this can also help against the learning effect. Because if people did one thing and they kind of remember the maze, if they come back after 2 weeks, they probably have forgotten about the maze mostly. So it's going to be a little bit fairer as a comparison if you do it that way. But I'll be honest, rest period is something we do fairly rarely because it's kind of hard to predict exactly how long you would need people to have rested before they are kind of, reset. and before the comparison becomes fair. So what we do much more often is counterbalancing. And counterbalancing means if you have two different conditions, you let half of your user base do condition A first and then condition B, and the other half of the user base does condition B first and then condition A. Very straightforward, right? So people first try the system with the maze with the mouse and then with the keyboard, and then the other half does it first with a keyboard and then with a mouse. So this counterbalancing helps you sort of kind of like this, you know, the effect of the within groups itself, where people do both conditions. It helps you to cancel the effects, the learning effects. However, just as with the within groups effect, be aware that it won't work to an arbitrary degree. If solving this, you know, if you ask people to solve a math problem with two different tools and it's the same math problem, they're always going to remember the result and they're always going to be super quick in the second case. So this is going to wash out any other differences you are trying to determine. So counterbalancing can be, you know, is usually an important thing to do, but you still need to make sure that the learning effect isn't too huge so that the second measurement is essentially useless. The problem, of course, of counterbalancing is if you have more than two conditions, this gets busy, right? If you have, for example, 3 conditions, then you don't just have 2 different orders, but you actually need to do 3 faculty different orders. So 3 by 2 by 1 by, so 6 different sorting orders to have all possible permutations of your conditions covered, right? So all of a sudden you've now split up your group into your users into 6 groups that each do a different version of your orders. And that often makes the individual user groups very small, and small user groups are not good because they don't give you the statistical power to show things that you can then report with confidence in your results. So cutting down the number of users that do the exact same condition is always a bit problematic. So there's a trick that people do that is called the Latin square, and you've maybe heard about the Latin square in you know, school mathematics or something. It's basically a simple algorithm that gives you a couple of permutations of your original order of conditions. Let's say you've got, you know, conditions, I don't know, A to F, A, B, C, D, E, F, and you want permutations on that. If you did it with counterbalancing, you would now have 6 faculty, so that's a lot, different orders, and that's usually impractical. If you do a Latin square, you only get 6 different orders, and they're not random. This is a Latin square example here of these 6 conditions A to F, and you can see we have 6 rows here. These are the 6 orders in which we do the conditions. So the first row is A, B, F, C, E, D. The second one is B, C, A, D, F, E, and so on. And what's interesting about the Latin square, I'm not going to go into the algorithm how it works, right? There's a fairly straightforward algorithm for it. You can look it up if you want. But the effect is that each condition actually precedes each other condition exactly once, and it also follows each other condition once. So we have basically not created a full permutation, but we've made sure that there's always one case in which one of our conditions happens before another one, and where it happens after the other one. Okay, so that's among statisticians usually considered, you know, a good enough solution if you cannot do the full counterbalancing. Another solution is just randomization, where you say each time a user walks up, we're going to randomly throw a condition order at them, right? That's another way to do it. It does prevent a systematic bias, a systematic, you know, skewing of your results towards one thing. But randomization is not the same as full counterbalancing, especially with small numbers, kind of like Latin square. It may not cover all combinations, right? It's not as good a coverage. And then I would probably say Latin square is better because it at least has this quality that we know about the order that every condition is once before and once after each other condition. All right, so we've figured out whether we go between groups, within groups. We've sort of split up our users. We figured out whether we need to do counterbalancing, Latin square, etc. So then we run the experiment, right? We do something. People, for example, need to measure. We measure the typing speed by having them, type a sentence and measure how long it takes them. Now we need to figure out what that means, right? So that's where statistics come in, of course. There's a great book called Quantifying the User Experience, Practical Statistics for User Research, a recommended reading, not a required one, but if you need to do anything like that, this is a good book to pick up and go through and look up the corresponding things. Especially as you remember from statistics, I'm sure, the tricky thing, especially for mathematically inclined people, is not so much applying the test once you know which one to apply, but the difficult thing is to figure out which one do we need to do, right? How do we argue for which test is the right one? We cover this topic in more detail in the current topics in HCI lecture, which is sort of your advanced placement research class if you're going for a thesis in our field or if you're generally interested in doing HCI research. And so I'm just going to, scratch the surface here and give you some practical usage and some practical guidance for doing simple studies in your, for example, bachelor thesis work or in your projects. There's a whole bunch of different tests. ANOVA is the one that probably most people remember. Analysis of variance, this is what it stands for. Very straightforward, easy to understand what you do. You got two Gaussian curves and you look at, how much do they, are they apart and how much do those curves overlap? So not just looking at the difference between the means, but actually looking at how far away are these two curves from each other. You can get a significant result with the means being just a little bit different, but having very spiky, narrow Gaussian curves, then that's a significant result. Or you can get one where things are much farther apart, but it's insignificant because the curves are so wide that they largely overlap each other. And then there's other things like the t-test, regression analysis, Wilcoxon or Mann-Whitney tests, chi-square tests. I'm not going to go into detail about each of those. The important thing to understand is you need to carefully figure out which test to apply, and that depends on a number of factors. It depends on how many different variables you're looking at. In the simplest possible case, we're only looking at one independent variable and one dependent variable, right? You also need to figure out whether your variables are discrete or continuous. So if, for example, touchpad versus mouse is a yes/no question that is a discrete example of a variable. You can't say, oh, people did 70% mouse, right? They either do one or the other. On the other hand, if you, for example, give people pencils of different lengths to do something, then the length of the pencil could be a continuous variable that you could choose put any random value on that scale. So that would be a continuous variable. Also, usually your dependent variables, the ones that you measure, tend to be continuous. Like, for example, execution time or even number of errors. Okay, so that's it's not fully continuous because you can't make half a mistake, but it's usually from a large number of discrete results, and you can order them, right? You know that 3 results is more than 2 results, right? There's a clear ordering to these. Whereas touchpad versus mouse, for example, there's no order of these variables. There's also, you need to also understand what the assumed distribution of those variables is. So for example, when lots of people do an experiment and they have a certain error rate in doing the experiment, you can usually assume that the results will be normally distributed. So a normal distribution giving you that classic Gaussian curve, but that's not always the case. So that's something to be aware of. And if your variables are not normally distributed, you need to do some statistical magic to transform them before you can actually apply certain tests. And finally, also, your choice will also depend on what kind of result you're looking for. Am I looking for just a yes or no? Like there's a difference or there's no difference between, execution times for 2 different conditions? Or am I actually interested in the size of the difference, how much faster one group is than the other? Or am I also interested in how confident I am that this measurement is correct, right? The more you ask for, the more profound and meaningful and useful your result is supposed to be, usually the tougher the statistics will go at your data, and the tougher it will be to actually prove that result, which is kind of self-evident, right? The more I want to claim about my findings, the harder it will be to actually prove that reliably. Kind of makes sense. Now, when you do your evaluation, there's two things you want to basically look for. First of all, it's got to be valid, and second, it has to be reliable. And we're going to look at each of those terms in turn here. Validity, in brief, means how accurate is what you're measuring or what you're reporting, and reliability means how consistent and stable is your finding, your result. This doesn't just apply to controlled experiments. This is really true for all kinds of evaluations, but we're looking at them here in the example domain of controlled experiments. So let's look at validity first. Validity, there's a couple different versions of validity. First of all, the so-called construct validity. This is one that is actually fairly easy to ensure. What we mean by this is that you need to move from your hunch and your initial sort of, idea about what you might be testing towards something that can be clearly manipulated and precisely manipulated or measured. Manipulated in the case of an independent variable, measured in the case of a dependent variable, of course. So, for example, if I say I want to compare the typing speed or the selection speed with two different, mouse models. You remember Microsoft Mouse, the many different models they made, right? Some of the experiments might be to see how fast people are with these. You can't just say, okay, speed is my independent variable. That's too imprecise, right? You need to be so constructive in your independent variable that it is something that can be precisely measured and manipulated. So, for example, time since the cursor leaves the start until it reaches the target, that's a precise and valid, constructually valid dependent variable. Then we have internal validity, and so construct validity is usually, straightforward. You will notice if you don't do that, because you will be like, all right, so what am I actually measuring? What am I throwing at my test here? The other two are trickier and are more often a problem. And often when I review Chi papers as a program committee member, this is often something that comes up. The first one is internal validity, meaning internal in the sense of inside my experiment. What you need to make sure in this are your statistics correct, right? Are you doing the right thing here? Is the inference you're doing in your causal inference chain, is it logical? And how strong is the connection that you're claiming? So when you observe people and you just do sort of informal observations of some users, and from that you derive that clearly pi menus are faster than linear menus, then that would be not very valid as an internal measurement. So usually internal validity is broken when you mess up something. For example, you might forget to counterbalance, right? You might get something where you run two conditions and you don't do counterbalancing. Condition B always happens after condition A, like using the keyboard is always after the mouse to acquire a target on the screen. And then when you look at the experiment after the fact, you notice that there was a huge learning effect that was being, that people had when they did the experiment twice with different conditions, and you didn't counterbalance. So then that would break your internal validity. Your statistical claims are just not internally backed up by what you did. There tends to be a better validity for internal validity in experimental methods, meaning those kinds of things that do controlled experiments like the ones that we're just describing here, than in those that are just looking at correlation between two data points or just describing an effect without making any numerical computations. The other one is external validity, and external in this case means it's all wonderful if you have a perfectly executed experiment and it's super reliably with high internal validity showing what you set out to show, but it's only applicable in a very particular area, right? Remember that, you know, that episode from Big Bang Theory where they said, you know, I don't know, something about, you know, how fast can chickens eat food or something. And then somebody said, gave a formula and said, but it only applies to spherical chickens in a vacuum, right? So if you have a very particular setting that you're looking at, for example, you ran an experiment only with 20-year-old students, then this doesn't readily generalize into any other populations, right? If you just did an experiment, you know, pulling your user base from 20-year-old students, then it won't be applicable to people living in a retirement home readily, right? For example. And I always use age because it's such a stereotypical example, but you know, this applies to all kinds of different user bases. And here we already know that when we study things in the lab, we usually get better internal validity because we can control everything. We don't have any side effects, right? We don't have phone calls disturbing our user session, for example, which may happen if you test in the field. So internally, lab experiments are usually more valid, but externally, when you study in the lab, it may not actually readily apply to the real world, right? Once you go out there and actually do this, what people did in the lab, and they do the same thing in the real world, things may be very different. So that's the general. Basically, when you do your research, you hand in a Chi paper. If you do a lab study, people will be, ooh, but your external validity is low. And if you do a study in the field, they'll be like, ooh, but your internal validity is low, right? So it's always, you know, one thing or the other is always jeopardized. All right, and then we've got reliability finally. That basically means the way that I set this up, can this be replicated by others and yield the same kind of results? Not exactly the same, of course, but are they going to be consistent and stable enough and dependable enough? So what this requires is, for example, that you are very clear about what you did. For example, if you say, and then we ran our magic algorithm and to control, you know, to let users control the cursor with their mouse, we used our magic mapping algorithm, and they are so much faster, then that's great. But if you don't tell anybody what that algorithm is, then it's a useless result, right? Because nobody else can replicate this. And in many areas of science in the world, replication is a standard part of research, right? So if you do a study in, I don't know, chemistry, for example, you claim that something is true, others will set out and try to replicate what you did. And if they can't, then they may challenge you and say, I don't know, this only seems to work in your lab, Bob. Your finding isn't replicable. That's not research, right? In HCI, this is also the gold standard, but we're still at the beginning of this. Chi is a young discipline. HCI is a young discipline. And so replication studies and the ethics and the going about user interface research and practice in a replicable way is not as much established yet in our field. But you need to describe clearly what kind of devices you used. That's why you often read, like, we used a 20-inch, monitor or something, or we used a mouse from this model, or we used this kind of hardware, or we used users with this background and this gender distribution, etc., etc. So there's also other causes that can create fluctuation. For example, of course, you cannot eliminate random errors, right? So when you measure 10 people and they do the same experiment, they're always going to be different speeds at which they complete it. And that's a random distribution. So, but if you test with more and more samples, that randomness tends to turn into, a nice Gaussian curve usually. However, if you have systematic errors, then you've got a problem, right? So if you, for example, always do one condition during the daytime and the other one in the evening, and people are just more tired in the evening, or it's darker and that's why they can't do the experiment as well, then you have a systematic error in your experiment. So your instruments could be off, or your procedures aren't properly randomized or not counterbalanced, which would be the example when I say like do one part of your study during the daytime and the other part during the night. Or your instructions could be biased. You know, here you are. You wrote your thesis, your bachelor's or master's thesis. So you got this thingamabob that you built, right? And it's this really cool thing that does something so much better than what everybody else does. So now you go out to your users and you say, oh, please perform the following task, once with the boring standard way of doing it, and once with my amazing new thingamabob that I built, that I spent 6 months of my life creating, and if it performs worse, then I'm going to die. So users will be slightly, you know, skewed towards liking what you built, right? Because your instructions were clearly biased. And then finally, your recruitment process also may filter participants unevenly. So for example, if you say, I'm going to test how easily people can use the new, I don't know, Facebook timeline feature or something, and you only recruit people among, you know, your Facebook friends, then that's clearly a pre-selected group, right? Or if you say, how good are you at using a smartphone, and you only look for people who you can reach via WhatsApp, then you know, those people obviously are, you know, already good at using their smartphone. So those are all systematic errors. The last example I gave with the, you know, your amazing thingamabob also could be described as your behavior as the experimenter, who's the person running the experiment with the participants. When you behave in a way that biases people towards, you know, preferring one solution or being better at using one version of your system than the other. And yeah, the physical environment, I think this is again, you know, when you for example do a test with two devices and you use them in a physical environment where it's like it rains all the time, and then one is maybe a spoken announcement and the other one is a display. That display is hard to read in the rain. Then you're preferring the spoken one through the physical environment, which can be okay if you're open about it. You say, we're going to test how well spoken versus, you know, display interfaces work in the rain. But if you forget about reporting that and you claim in general spoken is better than display because look at the results, and you don't mention that it was all performed in the rain, then that's, you know, a systematic error. So we want to avoid those kinds of systematic errors, obviously, and that's not always easy. So apart from this basically concludes the controlled experiments, right? So that's controlled experiments over. So now we're beyond E1 through E10 in our little tree. And we listed a few other things at the bottom of that tree overview, questionnaires, interviews, etc. These are other evaluation methods that are not things where you go through the interface step by step with a user or without a user, but rather other ways of collecting feedback. So a questionnaire is often something that our students send out as part of their thesis work to, for example, determine in general, how much do people use, let's say, the I don't know, serial mail letter function in Word or something like this, right? Then you can send out a questionnaire and ask people about it. Similarly, you can run personal interviews to figure something out. So for example, one of my PhD students, Krishna, learned a lot about how statistics workers, you know, people who work a lot with statistics, how they do their job by just interviewing them and asking them about their work practice. Or Marcel, who's currently doing his PhD with us, is interviewing people how they document their projects that they do in a fab lab, right? So those are examples of those kinds of format. And there's very clear instructions for this, how to do this properly, how to not introduce bias, etc., doing those things. So just because they're not numerical doesn't mean that they can be less impactful. Finally, especially in industry, once you've completed a project and you've shipped your app or whatever it is, don't stop evaluating, right? You've got email you got bug reports coming in via maybe email or via an in-app feature where people can report. You got the App Store reviews that you get. You got hotlines, or usually via email or chat bots these days, or online chat systems. And all of these are collecting for you vital information, especially about what's going wrong with your system. So this can be super valuable. You can also go out and proactively approach users who have been using your system for a long time, and again, ask them with interviews or with a questionnaire of how well they're getting along, or whether there's anything that you can do better. And finally, you can also observe them, right? You can go out and say, 2 years ago, we shipped the system to you. Let's go out there and watch, right? So for example, we installed this conducting exhibit that I talked about earlier in the prototyping class in the House of Music, Vienna. And then we just hung out during the opening week of the museum. We just hung out and watched real visitors come in, use the exhibit, and walk off again. And we learned a lot from that about things that we could change, improve, etc. Because that's real world use, completely unskewed by any lab artificial settings, and so that can be very valuable. Now, I promised that we'd look at how we work with users. Like, a lot of the things involve you dealing with users, and there's a couple of things you should be aware of when you set out doing your first user study. First of all, user studies are not exactly usually a comfortable thing for people to do, because there is a certain pressure to perform, not to make mistakes. A lot of people fall into a competitive thinking by that, because oftentimes it feels that the users are being tested and not the system. So you need to make extra sure that you treat your participants in user studies with respect at all times. Usually they donate a significant amount of time to your cause, and all they get for it is maybe, a t-shirt or some kind of, little compensation. So it's usually a volunteering effort pretty much. And so these people need to be treated with respect before the test, during the test, and after the test. So let's go through those 3 phases in turn. Before the test, most important thing is people are donating their time to you, so don't waste their time, right? So don't let the first wave of users come to you, one person comes in each hour or so, and then you discover during the first 5 users that your test routine actually doesn't work, right? The system crashes or the instructions are confusing. That's wasting their time, because you won't be able to use their data, and will have to have more people come in later. So run a pilot test with friendly subjects before, with your colleagues, your friends, to see whether you have debugged your test procedure sufficiently. Also, you should be really ready when the users arrive. So unlike the rest of your lives, where you usually waltz into a meeting at the time of the meeting, and then you're like, oh, hey, hi, so what's up today? You got to be there earlier, and you got to have everything ready. So when they walk in, it's like when you walk into a good doctor's office, they're ready to receive you. You're not waiting. I'm talking about good doctor's office, right? Not the bad ones. They're ready for you, and you start doing stuff immediately. You also want to make sure that people feel comfortable. That is, you need to stress the fact that, hey, thanks for coming in. What we're doing today is evaluating whether this system still has bugs that we can iron out, and you're going to help us do that. So if mistakes happen while you use the system, that's totally fine. In fact, that's what we're looking for, and it's certainly not your fault. It's the fault of our design, which we're trying to improve. So don't worry about those. This is exactly the kind of things we are looking for. Tell us if anything is confusing. Tell us if anything doesn't feel right, or feels too complex or unwieldy. The system may still have bugs that we're trying to find. And if at any time, people need to know that if at any time they feel uncomfortable continuing with a test, that they are free to stop, right? That they don't feel under no obligation to continue. Usually not a big deal with our kinds of tests, because we're not putting people under into psychological experiments of extreme trauma or anything like that. But still, you need to make sure that people know what their options are. You also need to obviously guarantee privacy, right? So you need to tell people exactly what you plan to do with their data. Like oftentimes you have to tell them, we're video taping this, we're audio taping this, we're capturing the screen, we're capturing your face, and we're capturing your hands, because blah, 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 you know, retrospective testing, analysis of results, et cetera, et cetera. And you need to tell them exactly what's going to happen with that data. For example, you can say after the test, our team is going to go through that data with, you know, me and my teammates, Bob and Jim, are going to go over this data, and we're going to look for patterns in the behavior here. They won't know your names. I'm the only one who knows your names. We're going to immediately anonymize your names and so on in the recordings and call you like user A through user F or something. And then after we've done those results, the actual video recording will not go anywhere else, right? This is not going to go anywhere else. We're just going to keep it until we've completed this project so we can back up our claims if we need to with the data. But we won't share this video recording with anybody else outside the three of us unless we ask you beforehand in writing and you agree. You often actually want to have an option to show individual recordings to other people. Sometimes they're the only way to prove that a certain effect is happening, or they're an extremely instructive example for you and your team, but maybe also outside your team. Maybe you want to present your results at a conference or to a board meeting, and you need to show some of these things. So then you need to go through and talk with these users about what you can share. You know, you can't just go in and show a video of a secretary failing to use a new office system, and when the boss sees that, he thinks the secretary is incompetent and fires her, right? That's not acceptable. Usually these things are captured in what's called a consent form. And if you've taken part in a test, in a user study with us, you know that we often have consent forms for it, which basically capture all these things. And then both sides sign these, and it's kind of like a little contract between the two parties so everybody knows exactly what's going on with the data that's being created. All right, and so then the last things are, you need to also make sure that you inform your users before the test starts, before the experiment starts. But that means, for example, explain what's being recorded, but you need to make sure that you don't bias people. So if you say, you know, we have, for example, we had a system in which we had a new technique to move through videos more efficiently, we thought. And so if you want to test that, you don't say, here's the standard way of doing it, and here's our cool new technique, but just say, we've got a couple different ways of navigating through a video here. We would like to compare these in their performance, right? So don't bias people when you answer those questions they're asking. If necessary, you can point them to you know, the time after the experiment, where you can then sometimes share the things that you couldn't talk about beforehand, not to bias your users during the experiment. Okay, and you, of course, only use people who are volunteering for this, and you make sure that this is all recorded in a consent form. There's standard forms for this. If you get into this kind of work with us, we'll show you examples of this. All right, second part, during the test. During the test, you are, again, not wasting the user's time, which means don't let them complete unnecessary tasks. If you are interested in whether your save dialog in an application that you redesigned is better than the old version, don't make them type in a one-page document that they then save, right? The typing in is not what you're interested in. So cut down your experiment to just the interactions that you find important, and don't waste their time. Again, you guarantee privacy. For example, during a test, nobody usually can watch, right? You do this in a closed room. Nobody else can be an onlooker in the experiment, because that just breaks privacy from the beginning, right? If they can walk off and say, oh, you wouldn't believe how bad this guy did in this experiment I just saw, that's not a good example. So as a little anecdote here, we had a student of ours running an experiment, and of course he guaranteed everybody privacy and so on. And then in his presentation just last week, he was asked a question, and he said, oh, well, yeah, so Marcel, when you did the experiment with me, you really preferred this one technique over the other, right? And nobody else did that. And Marcel was like, yeah, that's right. And oh, by the way, did you notice that you just broke your privacy, agreement that we had during the experiment, right? So you got to be careful about those things. And make sure people are comfortable, right? So you can design the task often that people have an early success so that they feel that they are competent using the system and not completely, struggling with it. The atmosphere should be relaxed. You've got to include breaks, give them coffee and whatever, drinks. Don't come in and slap down like this gigantic pile of paper in front of them. This is what we're going to do today, but give them the tasks one by one so that they can focus on just what's in front of them without feeling overwhelmed. Also, if they use the system and they make the mistake, don't sit there and cringe or like, oh no, I can't believe they're doing this. You want to make sure that they don't feel uncomfortable with what they're doing, right? You turn off your cell phone, obviously, and if things seem to become uncomfortable for the user, if they are really not making progress, if they're getting stuck, and you're doing a think aloud study where you really are not supposed to talk usually, then you just abort that condition. You say like, we're going to stop that part of the experiment, or we have something else that we'd like you to try as well. After the test, again, people want to be comfortable, so say thank you. They help you find ways to improve the system, most likely, right? So that's what you should let them know. And you inform them now. You can answer any questions they had that would have changed the experiment if they'd answered them beforehand. And then also you still want to make sure that you guarantee privacy. So you don't publish results that can be associated with individuals and only show recordings outside your group with written consent. So that's the controlled experiments and interviews and questionnaires complete. We've covered all these areas now, but we've kind of left this part, model-based evaluation, out because it's a big chunk, and I wanted to get through this so you get the overview of all the techniques first. We are going to talk about a few different techniques now that are based on models. What I mean by this is model-based evaluation are ways to use mathematical models to predict the performance in a user interface. The huge advantage of that, of course, is if I have a model of how people are interacting, then I don't necessarily need to build the system and test it with users. I can actually predict what's going to happen without running an experiment, which saves me a lot of time if it works. And that's kind of the key point of mathematical modeling. You don't need to have a working prototype. You can predict how people are going to perform just by having the mathematical description of that prototype. Fitts' law was an example of a simple way of describing or of predicting user performance just by knowing how far a button is going to be away and how big it is, right? We could actually compute how long it's going to take people to press that button without building the system and measuring it. And we're going to go beyond just that single button press now with a few examples of models. GOMS I want to introduce with a little story. In '95, Jacob Nielsen, who was a now famous web guru, web design guru, had less than 24 hours to recommend if adding 3 new buttons to a homepage of the company Sun, big microcomputer maker at the time, was a good idea or not. So these guys came like, hey, Jacob, we want to change our homepage, add 3 new buttons. Is it a good idea or not? Tell us until tomorrow. How are you going to do that? By the way, he found that each new button that was added, but that was largely unused, so that would only be followed very rarely. You've got like about us, and then company mission, and then you got products and so on, and support and so on. And so he found that every new button that was added but not used would cost visitors of the homepage, based on the visiting statistics that they had, an accumulated $500,000 per year. This led to the company then, after on the next day when Jacob reported these results, to remove 2 of the 3 new proposed buttons from their homepage design that they had planned to include. And the method that he used for this estimate was called GOMS, right? So this is the power of GOMS. You can really do very quick, off the cuff estimates with this because you don't need to run experiments. GOMS is old. GOMS is as old as this book, The Psychology of Human-Computer Interaction, von Cart, Moran, and Newell, that you may remember because the CMN model that we talked about for memory, how people remind with the 3 processors and the 3 kinds of memory in their head, that's from the same group of authors. So goals, operators, methods, and selection rules are the 4 principal components of GOMS, and that's the name of the system as well. So it's a super great, I think they just named it so that students would have an easier time learning it, right? So you know the name GOMS, and this already gives you the 4 letters of the 4 big parts that are part of GOMS that you should know about. It helps you estimate the execution times and learning times before a system is built. The fundamental components of GOMS are goals, and goals describe users' end goals, kind of like what we talked about in when we looked at Norman's model of the 7 stages of actions. However, it needs to be said, and this is important to understand for GOMS, these should not be tasks that are extremely creative, that need a lot of figuring out, that people do for the first time in their lives. So it's not, a good task would not be brainstorm a new design for Apple's next big, something, right? That's not a good task. A good task is, here's a manuscript, like a text, and I've marked up some typos in that text or changes I would like you to incorporate, and you go through and you include those changes in the text, right? Or you've worked on a shared document in Word, and somebody has put in a bunch of comments online, and you now go through one of these comments after the other, and you include them all in text and resolve them. So that's a typical task, right? So something that is very mundane, a routine task, something that I'm already, pretty good at. I don't need to figure this out. This goal that you have, for example, copy edit this manuscript, then leads to a hierarchy of sub-goals that are derived from that. Of course, copy editing the manuscript is a very fuzzy thing, but you can tell that it will consist of smaller parts that you are going to do many times, right? For example, selecting and deleting a word in a text, for example, could be part of this technique. Next up are operators. When the goal is sort of at the top of the tree of your GOMS model, the GOMS model is kind of like a tree. The goal is at the top. The operators are the leaves of your model at the bottom. And they are elementary user actions. So physical actions that you do, like pressing a key or selecting a menu on the screen. Or dragging and dropping an object from A to B on the screen, or reading a message that the computer displays. It could also be gestures or speech commands, right? Anything like that. And the key thing you need to know about these things is you need to know that these each take a certain amount of time on average. So it's similar to Fitts law, but a bit different. Because in Fitts law, we know exactly what we need to know, exactly what the distance is, what the width of the target is, and then we also actually kind of need to know the index of difficulty, right? What's the the index of movement? We need to understand both of these factors, right? We need to know what kind of device are we talking about? Are you doing this with your finger or with your mouse or something like this, or with a joystick? With GOMS, you don't know the precise distance from the source to the target, but you average over all possible distances. So to understand how long it takes to select a menu on GOMS, you just do an average of, you measure once, a million times, how long does it take people to measure, to tap on a menu, and then you've got an average number, and that's what you use for GOMS. So it's a little more coarse than Fitts law. It's not as precise in terms of I'm going to pay attention exactly to the distance between the current user's position and where precisely which menu they're selecting, how far that is away. But I'm just applying an average number, and on this is how long it takes on average to select a menu on a desktop screen, for example, with a mouse. So this duration is context independent. That's what we're trying to say here. It doesn't depend on the precise menu or the precise key that the user presses or the precise gesture or speech command that they issue. It's an average number. And then that's goals and operators. Methods are in between the goals and the operators. So while your goal is the root of your tree and the operators are the leaves, the methods are in between. They are basically procedures to reach a particular overall goal. And these procedures then are broken down into further sub-goals, recursively, or ultimately they end up having operators at the leaves of this tree. And this already would let you figure out how long a task takes. If you have how long it takes to run the individual operators, you can add that up, and then you know how long it takes to run a particular method, and then when you add up all these different methods, you would get a total goal. But GOMS doesn't just model one sequence of action through your system. It actually has selection rules as well. And these selection rules tell you which method gets used for a sub-goal how often. Give you an example. Let's say you've got to delete some text in your manuscript that you have to copy edit, right? And so there's a bunch of different ways you can do that. If it's only a single letter, you're probably gonna go there with your mouse cursor, click and press the delete key once, delete that letter, right? If it's a whole word, a long word in particular, you might actually instead double click and press delete to select the whole word and then delete it. Or if it's a shorter word, you might actually go there and just press delete 3 times because the whole double clicking thing is too complicated for you. And that will actually depend a bit on individual preferences, right? So we sometimes have different ways to reach the same target. A short word could be deleted by pressing delete a couple times or by selecting it and then deleting it. And even the selection could be done different ways. You could do it by, clicking and dragging by the selection, or by clicking at the beginning and shift clicking at the end. There's different ways of doing it, or by double clicking the word and then you've got the whole word selected. So there are different ways of doing these things, and which ones are preferred how often, statistically speaking, is also something you need to figure out, and then that goes into these selection rules. This is all very abstract maybe, so let me give you an example here with the copy editing.
Just 1 second. There is a question in the chat which is asking about your story about the costs which were created by adding the buttons. And the question is how those costs were created on the visitor's side. Okay, so since I'm not going to go into detail how he did that in the slides, just a quick summary. What he did was basically he used GOMS to figure out how long it takes to select a target based on the number of targets that are there. So it's easier to pick an option from 3 choices than from 15 choices, obviously. And to a certain degree, that also applies if you extend, for example, 3 home buttons on your home screen to 6 buttons, right? Which was the proposal. And so this extension, this longer time to make the right choice is perfectly validated if all these choices are roughly equally important. But if you have buttons, which he said, if you have buttons that only very few people will actually be interested in, then adding them to the home page leads to an additional effort of selecting the right button for everybody visiting that home page. So he's not proposing to leave that information completely off the site, but he was suggesting to place it, under one of the other buttons, right? That as a sub item, so less prominently. And then how does he get to numbers? Well, he figured out a time using GOMS that it would take people longer to navigate the homepage with these additional buttons. And then he used an average salary of the kinds of visitors that come to Sun's homepage, an average hourly salary. Let's say people on average, they're engineers going to the homepage, so they cost maybe the company $100 an hour, right, roughly. And from that, he said, and we've got, I don't know, 10 million visitors a year or so. And he figured out it takes everybody just a little longer to navigate the homepage, but it adds up to hours, which we can bill at an hourly rate for all the visitors that we get over a year. So in accumulation, all our visitors together are losing this $500,000 per year if these buttons get added. Let's say your overall goal is to copy edit a manuscript, right? And at some point in there is a sub goal that you need a method for to highlight some arbitrary text. And one way of doing that is to move your cursor to the beginning of the text, click with the mouse button, right? So you move your mouse pointer over the beginning of the text, you click so that the text cursor jumps there. Then you move your mouse cursor your mouse cursor to the end of this arbitrary piece of text that you want to select. Now you can hold down Shift and click, and that will actually select the text between your original cursor position and the new cursor position, right? And then finally, you want to make sure that you selected the right part of text. So you need to kind of, just verify, did I highlight the right part? These are the 5 steps here that we're seeing in this procedure, and that's one way to select some arbitrary text on the screen. And then there are, and this is the important part, times associated with this. Moving a cursor to the beginning appears to take 1.1 seconds. And that is because moving the cursor to the beginning is an elementary operation of basically just clicking at a particular location on the screen. So basically, if you ran lots of targeting experiments with different distances on the screen, you would end up with this average number that people take to do this. Clicking the mouse button after moving the cursor there actually takes a little bit extra time, but much less, just 0.2 seconds. Then moving the cursor to the end takes the same amount of time. Shift clicking takes just a little longer because you need to actually press down the Shift key with your left hand and then click with the right hand, and it's a little bit more involved, so it takes a moment longer for you to do. And the verification is an average number of verifying an elementary action that you did. Did this work? Did I select the right thing? And all these numbers were determined originally by experiments, lots of experiments that Carter and his colleagues did to have this, this repertoire of elementary operators available. Okay, so that's an example of a method in GOMS. The GOMS is not just one technique, although the one that I showed you so far is called sort of the classic GOMS, if you want. And that is sort of the original one that was proposed, with the goals, operators, methods, and selection rules. So what it does is it predicts essentially the time that an experienced worker needs to perform a task in a given interface design. Notice the word design here. We don't need the interface, right? As long as we know what it looks like, we don't need it actually to be working to run an experiment on. We can just compute the time that it will take people to do this. But GOMS was extended in different ways. One extension was actually a simplification. And that's also covered by Card and his colleagues. It's called KLM, keystroke level model, or KLM GOMS sometimes. What it does, it leaves in the idea that you have these individual operators to do stuff, but it removes the rest of the tree, of the GOMS tree. It removes the rest of this pyramid, if you want, so that you don't cover all the different variants of how people do things and how likely it is that they do this or this other thing. So it's only used for a particular determined sequence of actions. So it just consists of a sequence of, well, keystrokes or mouse clicks or elementary operators, essentially, without the overarching architecture above it. Very useful because it's easier and simpler and faster to do. It's very useful if you want to compare two tasks that you've got models for to figure out which one is going to take people longer on average. If you have to, well, you've got one task really and two different interfaces, sorry, two different interface designs that you're comparing. What it tells you is this one will probably be faster than the other one. You won't, although the GOMS tends to give you precise numbers, you got to be careful about the precise numbers because you may very well under or overestimate a certain operator, or the operator in your condition takes a little longer or a little shorter. But as long as it comes up in both conditions, it usually doesn't impact the ranking of the two interfaces. We'll have an example for this in a minute to get you guys to be more familiar with this. Then I said originally that GOMS actually lets you compute execution times and learning times. And execution times, I explained that we kind of like, you first go to a menu, then you click, then you verify whether you click the right select point, etc. And people tend to be faster than what GOMS predicts. For example, a lot of things we do in our mind in parallel. For example, when I have to select an arbitrary piece of text, I may, identify where I want to start. I move my pointer there, I click, and while I'm clicking, I'm already beginning to think about, okay, where's the end of this? And then I move down there, and as I click, I already start verifying whether I've got the right part selected. So we tend to be a bit faster. And when you think about the cognitive and motor and perceptual processor that we talked about in the CMN model, then you will understand that these processes can, in part, also work in parallel. And studies showed that the linear model that was originally proposed with GOMS was a little overestimating the time it took people to do something. They were a bit faster, and it turned out that they were faster because they were parallelizing things in their mind. And so the critical path method, CPM GOMS, does that. It actually tells you that it doesn't take quite as long as the original model predicts because you do things in parallel. So this actually gives you more accurate absolute times of how long it takes people really to do something, better than GOMS itself does that, because it considers these overlapping paths that people take through an interaction. And finally, there's the natural GOMS language model, which was an extension of GOMS to also understand learning times of a system. So it wasn't modeling how long it took people to do a task, but how long it took them to learn how to do the task. And so that's an extension of the GOMS model. Since the keystroke level model is so useful for a quick, back of the napkin kind of estimate to which design will be better, or just to explain to your friends why they should really be learning those keyboard shortcuts in their application, here's the keystroke level model. The keystroke level model says that the execution time for a task is simply the sum of times that you need to perform elementary gestures of the task in serial, in sequence. And a gesture doesn't mean just waving your hands around like we talk about gestures today, but gesture is also a mouse click or a keyboard click or a mouse move or something like this. And the typical vocabulary that you use in KLM, the typical operators that you have available in KLM are the following. Keying, which means I tap a key on a keyboard, or also I I click a mouse button on the mouse, and that takes in the GOMS model roughly 0.2 seconds. So on average, if you have people tapping lots of keys, like entering a command or something, they type here, the estimate is with 5 keys per second, which translates to about 300 letters per minute, which is pretty fast if you continue to write. But remember, we're not talking about you looking at a text and entering it, because that also includes the looking and the thinking and what am I supposed to type. So this is just for short things. Let's say I ask you all to type in, you know, dir for listing the directory on a Windows computer command line, and you type dir, right? This is going to take you roughly these 0.2 seconds per letter. Pointing then is pointing to a position on the display with the mouse. Takes a bit more than a second, 1.1 seconds on average. The experiment showed. And homing is an important one. Homing means I move my hands from the keyboard, where I'm currently busy typing, to the mouse to operate it, or I move from the mouse back to the keyboard to do something there, right? So that's changing the input device. Takes 0.4 seconds. And then finally, there's the mental preparation or verification operator. You can think of it in any way. You can either say, before each action, I mentally prepare myself to do it, or you can say, after I did the action, I mentally verify that it worked. In either case, you've got these thinking pauses in your interactions. And those on average, for example, when you like select a text and then you verify it's the right one, turns out takes 1.35 seconds. And this is, again, routine thinking, right? Not like, I'm writing my thesis, am I explaining this right? Not, that's this kind of thinking. Really just verifying that my elementary operation worked out well. Finally, these are all so far times that the user takes. Sometimes you've got the system also making the user wait, right? If I try to open a remote website on a slow server, it may take some time until I get the results back, right? Or if I download a large file from a server, that may take a few seconds. And that's something that the GOMS model cannot model on average, because this really totally depends on the task. So you need to keep in mind that these response times could be in the system, and you need to model those explicitly for a keystroke level model's task. You might say, well, but while the system is doing something, the user isn't actually busy. So why are we not just parallelizing it? Well, obviously, sometimes you need to wait for things for the system to complete. And also, after, there is this issue that we already know that after 100 milliseconds, the idea of causality breaks down. So if the system delays things for much longer, the user will try again after about a quarter of a second, which kind of then adds to the response time. Okay, so let's do a sample keystroke calculation here. How does that work? You first list the required gestures, one after the other. For example, if you are in a graphical application where you're interacting with your mouse, and the task is now to press a single key on the keyboard. For example, Photoshop has lots of single key shortcuts. And let's assume for the moment here that you have to use the same hand for this. Then we would have to model, move the hand from the mouse to the keyboard and type a little letter, right? That would be the sort of interaction. H for homing and key for keying. Now, you include the mental preparation times, M, right? As I said, we could consider this as preparation or as verification. In the sequence of KLM, we consider them as preparation times. So because it's difficult to place these, because we do this unconsciously, there are rules that are a little involved and a little weird. So bear with me while I explain these. How you place these M's, these mental preparation operators, because we're going to actually flood our sequence with M's, and then we're going to remove certain M's again to clean up the list. It's a little bit sort of backwards, but this is how it works. And then after you've placed your M's, you add the timings of each gesture. So for example, let's say you've got an interaction of homing, then a mental preparation, then a pointing and a keying action. So this would be, for example, let's say you are at the keyboard and you now have to select a menu with the mouse, right? So you would have to home, move your hand to the mouse. You would have to then mentally prepare what you're going to select, which menu, and then you point to the menu, and you click the menu. These are the 4 sequences that we're seeing here, HMPK. And those would add up to 3 seconds, right? 3.05. For the sake of explaining these little involved M operators, we're going to introduce a little bit of lingo. We talk of strings, a sequence of characters, not surprising, I guess. A delimiter, you know what that is. You know, it's any character that marks the beginning or end of a meaningful unit, like, for example, the enter key after a command that you enter on a command line terminal interface. We've got operators, keying, pointing, homing, and we've got the any arguments that are supplied to a command. So, for example, if you say on a Unix terminal ls and then a space and a tilde, ls is the command to list the directory, and you know the tilde is the command, is the argument to that command, which points to your home directory, right? So here are the rules for placing M's. First of all, you throw lots of M's at this. You insert M's in front of all key presses, and you place M's in front of all pointing actions that select commands, like a menu, for example. But you don't place it in front of P's that select arguments for those commands. What that means is if I have a graphical interface where I select an object and then I trigger a command on it, like color this object in blue or fill this object in Photoshop, I would not add a P in front of selecting the circle that I'm filling, but I would put a P and M in front of the pointing action that selects the command to fill that circle. Now we delete some anticipated M's. We have just thrown lots of M's in front of key presses, even if the key press is the button click I do after moving the mouse to a certain target. Right? So here's my target that I want to click on. It's a menu item. I'm moving my mouse there. That's the pointing action. And then I'm clicking on that target, right? That's the keying action. Since that in our mind becomes a single gesture, we do this in one flow. We don't go there, then stop for 1.35 seconds and think about whether that's the menu you want to hit and then click. This happens in one go. So we can remove those M's again. So these PK sequences don't keep the M in between. We then delete other M's. We delete any M's that are inside cognitive units, which is a continuous sequence of type characters forming a name. What that means is, for example, the ls command that I talked about earlier that lists the contents of a directory in Unix is something that you don't press the L and then you think, what's the next letter I'm going to press? Oh, an S. You know I need to type ls. You thought about that for a bit, but then it's just a flow of characters that you type. So the sequence ls enter to list the contents of the current directory is originally just 3 keys. Then we introduce M's in front of each of these keys, like MK, 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 and then we remove again anything inside that that word except for the first, right? So we leave one movement, a mental preparation operator before the ls, but between the L and the S, we don't actually leave a mental preparation operator. We do leave in the one before pressing the return key for now. Okay, so that's inside cognitive units. You know, these sequences that make up a name that we know. Then we delete M's before what's called consecutive terminators. So, for example, if you have something like, you know, blah, enter, enter, you would have a mental preparation in front. Then you've got the 3 keys because we have already removed the M's inside the, you know, this sequence. So we don't have another one between the BL or between the L and A. And then we have a mental sort of verification pause before we actually hit the return key for the first time. That stays in. Okay, so you got the mental preparation before the command and then before you press enter. But if we need to press enter twice, it's a sequence of delimiters. So we remove the second M in front of the second K here. So we end up with this sequence. Think, enter, blah, think, press return again. Finally, we also delete the M's that are actually themselves at terminus of a command. So if the key is a delimiter that follows the constant string, then we also delete the M in front of that. But that is only true for commands, not for variables or things that you only type occasionally. So for example, the clear command here and the enter has so far become a mental operator, these K, L, E, A, R keys, and we still have that mental operator in here before the return, but we remove that as well. So it now becomes just a mental operator and clear and return. So we've, at this point, actually removed the mental operator right before the return key after a fixed command. Important to understand that clear doesn't take any arguments, so it's a constant string. When you type clear, it's this thing that you do a million times when you're on the command line, let's say, and it's a constant string and you hit enter. With ls, it doesn't work because ls could also take a command, so we don't take it out because we need the mental operator to think about, am I adding an argument or not? Okay. Finally, we remove any overlapping M. So if there is a mental preparation operator that is happening while the system is busy, then we don't need to count that time twice, obviously, right? We've got a clear case of parallelism there. If there is a mental preparation that I can already do while the system is doing something else, then I can do that. Of course, if I need to wait for the system to complete and then react and mentally prepare for my next action, then I can't remove that. It's only if it really overlaps an R sequence. Basically, this is suggesting while you're waiting for the system to complete and come back to you, you're already mentally preparing your next step. All right, this is a bit abstract, I know. So we're going to do an example. Our famous temperature converter. This is an in-class exercise. You've got a task now. You will need a bit of a pencil and paper at this point. And I would like you at home to sketch a little interface that would be able to convert temperatures from Fahrenheit to Celsius or in the other way. What we're writing is we're writing a tiny little app, right, that people would fire up on their computer. So imagine a laptop computer for now, because we're going to use the desktop-based M's and K's and stuff for estimation. So not a mobile app, not a smartphone app. It's a computer app that runs on your desktop, and it's supposed, when it runs, it should let me convert a number that I enter from Fahrenheit to Celsius or in the other way. And you can assume that both directions are equally likely, right? This is software we're writing for, Bob, the lab assistant, who needs to constantly do these kinds of computations while he's running his lab experiments in the biology lab, for example. You can use the keyboard or the mouse to let people interact with your little app. It's your choice what you want people to do with what. And you can make some assumptions. You can assume that your app has already been launched, it's running. It's the active window, so it's in the front. I don't need to bring it to the front. It's awaiting input, so you can basically say that you already have the system basically at front and being the one that would receive any input you now do. And you can make the assumption that people are not going to make mistakes typing in the numbers. And you can also make the assumption that people are going to enter 4 letters on average by doing this. So this includes the minus sign for negative temperatures and the decimal point for decimal temperatures. So first task is draw a little user interface. What do you think is going to be reasonably efficient to use in order to do this kind of conversion? We have basically a radio button to pick one or the other direction. And we have a field in which we enter a number. and then we have a result field in which the result appears, right? This is not such a bad design. It's sort of fairly straightforward. Okay, thank you. So let's look at what that means if this was the way that our system is designed. What does our GOMS analysis return for us? Like, how can we figure out how efficient, if you want, this interface is just by, you know, thinking about it without actually building it or running tests? So we're gonna we have two basic cases in our interface here. One case is we can assume that we need to first select the right direction for conversion, right? So if the interface shows Fahrenheit to Celsius and I need to convert the other direction, then I need to first select this other radio button, right? That's case one. So that means we're assuming the hands are at the keyboard. That's our starting position, right, where we are. So the person moves the hand to the mouse, moves it over there, then takes the mouse and points to the other button, you know, to change the keyboard, to change the conversion direction, and clicks it. That's homing, pointing, and keying. Then that person needs to move her hands back from the mouse to the keyboard, type in the 4 characters. On average, we said it's on average it's 4 characters, right? You know, digits and the decimal point and the minus sign maybe, and hit enter. So that means it's another homing action, and it's the 4 keying actions plus the enter. Because before you type enter, you wouldn't know what the number is to convert, right? In this system, the system only converts when the user confirms their entered number with the enter key. That's the design that I was assuming for this first naive approach. There's different ways of doing it, but let's assume for now that this is how it works. So basically, as you know, when you need to respond to something in a text field, oftentimes the text field requires you to somehow requires the user to confirm that they're done editing the text field, and the done editing is what triggers usually the callback to actually do the conversion, right? That's what we're assuming here. Standard behavior of most user interface toolkits. Now, then we apply rule 0. We throw lots of M's at this, right, in front of pretty much everything. And then we delete the anticipated ones, the ones that are between the point and keying, where we have, moving to the button and clicking it. That's not that many. And then we apply rule number 2, deleting all the M's within cognitive units. Again, that's also not that terribly many, but we have them inside the number, right? We're entering the number, and when we're done entering the number, we basically stop to think and look at if we entered the right number, and then we hit OK. We don't stop for 1.5 seconds between every single digit of the number. We know we need to enter -35, for example, right? So the result then is the sequence that you see down there: homing, a mental preparation, then pointing and keying to change the direction of conversion, then homing back to the keyboard, typing in, mentally preparing what's the number I need to enter, typing it in, reflecting if I entered the right number, and hitting enter to convert. If you add that up with the basic conversion rules, or with the basic lengths that the GOMS model gives us, you end up with about 7.15 seconds. Case 2 is if the conversion direction is already selected, so we already know that it's basically set to Fahrenheit to Celsius, and that's exactly the direction we want. So we save ourselves the whole radio button press, and we end up just with the sequence of entering this number. In this case, we have a mental preparation. We've got the 4 numbers on average that we enter. We've got the mental verification of the number, and the enter key adds up to 3.7 seconds. Basically, one key is 0.2, so 5 keys is 1 second, and each M is 1.35, so 2 of them is 2.7, gives you 3.7 in total. So on average, since I said that it's equally likely that each direction will come up, you can expect an interaction and a conversion task to take the average of these two numbers, right? 5.4 seconds. So that's basically what the average interaction time with this system will be. So if you look at your own system, we don't need to do this now, but what I encourage you to do is, after we're done for today, maybe go through your own design and figure out how long would mine have taken. We're actually going to come back to this later in this class today. We're going to do a couple of improvements and alternatives, and you can see how well yours is going to be doing among the competition that we have of different systems. Okay, so what we're getting out of GOMS here is clearly execution times for very well-established actions, right? For tasks that people know very well. Right? So we've got trained users, routine users that do repetitive tasks or goals. And because we can estimate the execution time, and with the natural GOMS language, which we're not going into detail about, also learning times, we actually get, as a result, we get the cost of training, we get the daily, the cost of daily use, and we also get, in certain cases, also what it costs if people make mistakes. Now, mistakes we haven't modeled here, but the natural GOMS language model, for example, extends this whole learning aspect of GOMS. The key point is, even if we can just estimate the execution time, if we know how expensive the time of somebody working in a company is, we can turn that into euros or dollars. And that's an important language to speak if you want to make your case in a business environment, right? Because then you can say, all right, so obviously, if we use this interface, this is going to take people this long. And so we're basically burning that much money each year by having people use this interface. Here's this other interface, which maybe takes a little bit of training, and we need to hire a trainee and spend time training. So that's going to cost us this amount X. But after that, people are going to be faster with this because it's more efficient. And so overall, after a year or two, this will have amortized itself and will actually be more cost effective. So this is good to model alternatives, right? So there's a wonderful example from an early paper from '93 where there was a phone company, 9X, and they had a system for their operators, right, that were putting calls through, and it was very text heavy. It was a very command line based interface, and they were considering this was in the 80s, 90s, so graphical computer interfaces were becoming all the craze. The Mac had come out in '84. So they were like, let's do a GUI, right? Let's do this with a point and click interface. That's going to be so much better, right? And then Gray and his colleagues ran his study and actually evaluated using GOMS how fast the new proposed system would be that was being suggested to use instead of the old command line based one. And they found that it actually would have cost the company $2 million a year more for operators to use the new system because they were just slower on it. Because for this task that they had a keyboard-based system. There was no homing to the mouse at all, no selecting menus and stuff. These people were highly trained. They were doing a very repetitive and very, very high input rate task. And even if you figure in the cost of training, it could have been interesting if the new system was going to be faster. But it wasn't, because actually in a purely text-based environment, if you move to including the mouse as an interaction point, it can actually significantly add to the execution times because of all the homing back and forth from keyboard to mouse. That's not to say that the new system wouldn't have been easier to learn, possibly. So training new people would have been cheaper with the graphical system maybe, but it turned out that people were, after the training, were doing this job so long that on average, it just wasn't paying off to use a less time-efficient interaction metaphor with the mouse and keyboard, rather than just using a good old keyboard-based interface for this. a surprising finding, because then, you know, GUIs were all the craze. And so it's good if you have some mathematical models that will actually, you know, show you the truth to a certain degree, or give you a way to estimate the effects of a change before you do it, just because the new system is you know, shiny and apparently the way to go these days. So it also lets you therefore estimate the effects of a redesign, right? So with the 9X, this was an example where if you redesigned the system, it was actually going to be slower than the old one, so that was a bad idea. But even if you have a system that is faster, you can then say, okay, I'm going to be this much faster on average. I'm going to spend this much money on training. So after that many years, the switch will have amortized itself and will begin to pay off. Finally, GOMS has another interesting side effect. Remember what I showed as the rule to select some arbitrary text? That looks suspiciously like online documentation, doesn't it? You know, it's like a cookbook recipe for, if you need to select some arbitrary text, do this, right? So actually, the GOMS model can be a great start for a document that explains the online help and that can be used in tutorials to step people through elementary actions, right? To explain that, not for the very high level things, but you know, the GOMS model is actually a structured breakdown on how you complete a typical task. So it's a great starting point for documentation. So I have a question for you. We were designing this, we've designed a couple of exhibits and museum guides over the years. And if you design an interactive system, would you create a GOMS model for this? Would the GOMS model be useful? And if so, what could I derive from the GOMS model?
Like, I'm not sure why not to go for GOMS, because I think it doesn't look like it's a lot of effort. So maybe you can do that initially with your first idea and do that to see how the numbers look like, if that's good. So you can go on with your idea maybe, and then do other evaluation techniques. So I don't know why I would go for it. I think I would go for it then.
Okay. Kaya, what do you think?
I wouldn't go with GOMS because for an interactive museum, there are no efforts, no need to take the time. I think in an interactive museum, it's more important that users understand the system, like it's interactive, not sufficient in its time.
Okay, that's an interesting argument. All right, so let's Fabian has another opinion.
I think if you're in an interactive museum, you're actually there to spend time, so it does not matter how much time you spend there. And the usability should be as comfortable as possible, and the time you need to select certain things does not matter, because you're actually there to spend your time there, and it's your free time. You're willing to spend it at a museum. Okay,
I love the heated discussion. We're going to get to a fist fight in a moment, but Victor, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that the environment is different. So usually, I think GOMS is more relative to usual workspace where you're in front of the computer and you do some stuff like the web, for instance. But for interactive museum, yeah, it's not.
You're bringing up a different aspect that I like. I'm gonna talk about that in a second, but I'll give Julia a chance of the final retort.
Yeah, I would like to comment on the argument about you don't need time in a museum. So I've been to many science museums, and there were always some exhibitions with, I don't know, technical stuff where you can click on stuff and try something out. And any device that was presented there that took too much time, because there are many things that they present that really are slow because, I don't know, maybe it doesn't matter, as you said. They annoyed me, and then I just went away. I was waiting, like, is it coming or not? Okay, whatever, I'm going to the next device. So I'm not sure about that argument.
Yeah, good point. So first of all, you're right. actually, even though you're in a museum and you're there at your leisure, it certainly is not a productive work setting. I totally agree with this. What we found when we were designing museum exhibits, though, is that time actually does matter. And in part for what Julia was saying, when something takes too much time, it becomes uninteresting for the users, but also the museum has a vested interest in visitor flow, right? So they are interested in getting people to work and interact with their systems. But they're also interested in them after a while to move on again, right, and do something else. So the interaction time is certainly something that you don't want to necessarily ignore completely. You need to keep it under wraps. Now, Victor mentioned something interesting. He said a museum exhibit often has this, like, non-standard interfaces and not just standard mouse keyboard office setup. And that's a good point. If your system actually has some significantly different fundamental interaction operators, then you can still apply GOMS, but you would have to know what the length and the time for each elementary operator is. So let's say it has a touch interface, like a mobile touch interface. You would need to figure out how long does it take people to select and do their basic things on a touch screen. So the lack of operators is something that will make it a little more difficult to use GOMS right out of the box, but not impossible. I think it doesn't rule out GOMS. Interestingly, what you didn't bring up is something else, and that is when you think about what we say here at the top of the slide, trained routine users for repetitive tasks. A museum visitor usually comes to the museum once, and Julia, I don't know, maybe you keep going back to the same museum exhibits, but usually people only interact with the museum exhibit once in their life, right? Until it's so amazing, unless it's so amazing that they keep going back. So it's usually a first-time user who hasn't seen the system yet. They need to wrap their head around it anyway. As Fabian was pointing out, usability is certainly important, and ease of use, ease of initial learning, getting people to ease into the experience and not be confused and stuff like this. Performance doesn't matter in that respect, but it also means even if performance didn't matter, we couldn't really apply GOMS because the numbers GOMS gives us is for people who have used the system long enough so that they are trained users. So that's something to keep in mind, right? Whenever you talk about casual use of something where people just encounter a system and haven't really seen it before, or new user interface technologies, input devices, and techniques, then you got to be careful, right? In the first case, GOMS really doesn't apply at all unless you use the natural GOMS language model, which lets you then estimate learning times. And if you have new user interface techniques, you need to at least figure out the operator lengths for this, or need to do a literature review to see if somebody else has figured that out. For example, of course, mobile interaction has become so omnipresent that people have run studies and determined operator length for mobile interfaces, right? For like interacting with a smartphone, for example. So you wouldn't have to do that yourself anymore, but it needs to be done whenever you have a new interaction model. All right, great. So in the last 30 minutes, I want to talk a little bit about information efficiency. And information efficiency is another way of a mathematical model of thinking about the user interface and reasoning about it and computing properties of it without having to go and build and test it. What we mean with interface efficiency is how can we determine the amount of information that is being communicated through a UI, and how can we figure out if our interface does that in the most effective way or not. So we want to figure out, is there a theoretical limit to the efficiency, like how fast I can be with the user interface? We use information as the quantification here of the amount of data that is conveyed through a communications channel. This is based on information theory. So something you may be familiar with from the Shannon's work and maybe heard about in theoretical computer science. We're going to use that model here to compute the channel capacity, basically, of different UI constructs. And this information can be, of course, being from the user to the system as input, but it can also be from the system to the user as output, right? And in different ways. For example, if I speak a command to the interface, I've provided some information. If the system sends back a message to me after I clicked something, it's giving me information. So the claim here is that for many tasks that you do with the UI to operate an interface, you can actually compute a theoretical lower bound of the amount of information that is required to provide the system with all the information that the task needs. And that amount is independent of the UI design, which then means that if you design an interface, you can then look at how close does my interface become to this theoretical lower bound of how much I need to do to control the interface. For this, we define the notion of information theoretic efficiency, then, the minimal info required for the task in relation to the information that the user is actually supplying. So what that means is this is a value between 0 and 1. So 0 means that the information that the task does not require any information, right? So for example, here is a wonderful dialogue that Word used to feature on the Mac in the days back, when you were doing a search for something and it wasn't finding it. It would pop up a dialog saying Word has finished searching the document, and you had to click OK. But there is no option to do anything here. Like completing this dialog is not providing any information to the system. It's just displaying it to me, and I need to click OK. So this system is highly ineffective because I'm doing something, although there is no information that I'm providing to the system. Because the only way that a user can provide information to the system, according to Shannon's information theory, is if he has a choice. If I get a dialog with 2 buttons on it that say, do you want A or B? And I click A or B, then I'm providing 1 bit of information to the interface, to the system, right? But if I only click on OK, then yes, the system knows I've seen and acknowledged the dialog, which can be interesting for other reasons in the interaction flow. But from an information theoretic standpoint, this is 0 information that's being provided to the system. It cannot act any different after I have provided the information one way or the other, because I can only click on OK. So if you've listened to Mark Uwe Kling's Quality Land novel or read that, then clicking on OK is the only option left to the user in many cases today. And that's not providing information to the system. It's not giving me a choice. Similarly to this general information theoretic efficiency, we can think about this in the context of character-based interfaces where you type input. There, it's the same thing, right? The number of characters that the user enters related to the minimal number of characters that will be necessary for this task. And so that's, again, giving us an efficiency measurement of how information efficient our interface is. So let's quantify some basic input techniques. If we measure information in bits, and a bit represents choices between 2 alternatives, then it's pretty clear that if both choices are equally likely, then according to Shannon, with 2 equally likely alternatives, we're providing 1 bit of information, or log 2, right, to the base log 2 of 2. And similarly, if you have 8 equally likely alternatives, then the total information provided in your interface is basically log 2 of 8, right? So 8 different things can be stored in 3 bits, and the log 2 of 8 is 3. the information that each of these alternatives then provides is, of course, 1/8 of these 8 different choices that we have. So this is basically just saying that we need to do a logarithmic transform to get from, you know, the number of alternatives, number of different values, if you want, to the number of bits to represent these values. And we're very familiar with that in computer science, so not a big deal. Now, it gets a little more hairy if the different alternatives that I'm talking about are not all equally probable. If, for example, you have a dialog with 2 options, and one is very likely and one is very unlikely that you will press it, then actually, on average, the information that you're providing to the system is now going down, because it can almost guess that you're going to press the first button, right? That's the sort of, you know, a naive layman's way of interpreting Shannon's information theory. The information that is being provided per alternative at that point then is the likelihood of that particular one times the logarithm of that fraction here. And the total amount then is the sum of all of these alternatives. This means that we are considering not just, you know, a single character sequence being entered, but we're considering the situation as a whole, where the user has different choices of what they can enter and how likely it is that they enter these choices. So we need to know how probable different things are that the user enters or that the system displays in order to determine, to know their probabilities, and in order to determine this overall information theoretical channel capacity. As another sort of naive way of thinking about this information theoretical capacity, you can imagine it as information measuring freedom of choice. So information in particular doesn't mean meaning in this, it just means how many different choices does the user have to pick different things, and the more choices they have, the higher the information is that they actually transmit over the channel, because the number of choices available are bigger, so it's less easy to predict what's going to happen. That's kind of the intuitive way of thinking about this. Now, I promised you we'd come back to the temperature converter, and if we take our assumptions that we had, we said half of the cases when people use your converter is going to be from Fahrenheit to Celsius, and the other half is the other direction. We also said that it's always going to be 4 characters of input, and now we need to be a little more specific if we want to really, you know, compute the information theoretic interface efficiency of our UI. We're going to say that most of the numbers are positive, like 3/4 are positive, 1/4 is negative, so it's going to have a minus sign, right? We're also going to say that we don't enter integer numbers, we're always going to have a decimal point in there. And these assumptions are maybe not 100% what you would observe in real use, but they are reasonable simplifications of the setting to be able to start doing some computations. If you really wanted to know this precisely, you would actually have to run an experiment and determine this mix of positive and negative numbers. And that kind of defeats the point of model-based evaluation, because we want to do this without running lots of experiments. So we're making some simplifications here, which is a very typical approach. And you know this from physics, simulations and stuff like this. You make some assumptions that simplify your problem so it becomes tractable. We also assume all digits are equally likely, so we don't have a particular, likelihood for zeros or ones to come up more often than 2s or 3s. And as we always said, we have only 4 characters of input. Now, with these assumptions in place, we can actually do a keystroke efficiency analysis of our interface, because we know that what we need to do to operate this interface is I need to I'm sorry, this is an interface that I haven't shown you yet. This is a key-based interface that, as you can see in the instructions here, you have to indicate the desired scale by typing C for Celsius or F for Fahrenheit. Then you type the numeric temperature, and then you press enter, and that will display the conversion. Okay, not the same interface that we saw earlier. So this one is a purely keyboard-based interface. And it gets down to, you type a C or an F, then you enter the value, and then you press the enter key. So in all, we have a mental preparation. We have before the C or F, then the 4 digits that we type in, and then we have another mental verification operator here, and then the enter key. This translates to an overall duration of this particular interface of 3.9 seconds. Now, how efficient that is, we can only say after we've seen a couple more numbers. So I'm going to show you the other examples here as well. If you get it to change a little in this second example here, I'm saying don't type C or F and then the 4 numbers and then enter, but I'm actually asking you to first enter the number and then just type a C or F. And that has 2 purposes. It tells me whether you're entering a Celsius or Fahrenheit value, and it starts the conversion. So it's also the delimiter for your number. It's a small change in the interface, not an immediately obvious one. It needs a little bit of thinking to come up with this idea, but let's see what that does. It actually means that we're now entering the value in the second field here, and then just a C and an F. So we've got a mental preparation, we've got 4 digits, M, K, 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 another mental operation, and then we enter the C or F to basically both terminate our number and tell the system whether I want a Celsius or Fahrenheit, whether this is Celsius or Fahrenheit. And that actually brings the efficiency down to 3.7 seconds. Now, can we do even better? We could have what you could call a bifurcated interface. This interface lets you type in a number at the left-hand side, and you don't specify the value of Celsius or Fahrenheit anymore at all. It basically just says, well, if you're entering a Fahrenheit number, then look at the top, because I'm going to turn your number, assuming it was Fahrenheit, into Celsius. And at the bottom, I'm going to assume your number was Celsius, and I'm going to turn it into Fahrenheit. I'm going to show you 2 numbers, okay? That's a little bit more complex and maybe more difficult to read, but I'm only interested in how far can I drive down the number of things I need to do to operate this interface. How far can I push the character efficiency? Now, with the bifurcated interface, it actually no longer requires a termination key either, because we're assuming that it does the conversion as you type, right? So if I type a 1 in there, it'll immediately convert the 1 into Celsius and Fahrenheit. If I then type a 0 behind that, it will take that as a 10 and immediately convert that into Fahrenheit. So I can just keep typing. And that, for the single task of converting a number, means that I'm down to a mental prep and then my 4 Ks that as I type in the number. And that is a character efficiency of 100%, because the total amount that the system needs, we found, is actually just these 4 characters, right? So what I need to provide to the system is 4 characters. I don't necessarily need to provide anything else. I can even do away with the information whether I picked Celsius or Fahrenheit, because the system can just do both and show both results to me, and I read the one that I'm interested in. So that's an interesting twist on the story here, which shows that if you really need to optimize an interface to be as efficient as humanly possible, think about what information must I provide, which information is completely not negotiable, basically, and then think about, can I bring my interface as close as possible to this optimum efficiency? Now, this does have issues, no question, right? For example, if I do this once, this is super fast, right? This interface, assuming the window is up and it's active, I literally go to my keyboard, I type, 10.5, and the result is there, bam. I don't need to reach to my mouse to select keyboard is Celsius or Fahrenheit. I don't need to type a C or an F. I don't need to type enter. It just works, right? It's as short as possible. And somebody who needs to do a lot of conversion would probably really like that. However, we do run into a couple issues. For example, what if this interface then is to be used again? How do you clear the field? You could say, well, I'm going to do that by hitting backspace a couple times, but then we become very inefficient for everything after the first conversion, right? When you use the system again and you have to type backspace 4 times, you're down to a character efficiency of 50% because you type 8 characters for a 4-character information input. Or you could say, well, I'm going to introduce a timeout that after a while clears the field automatically. Well, as you will learn in the next lecture, timeouts are evil, and they always mess up people's interaction with interfaces. So it's not a great usability choice, but it would make the interface from a character efficiency, again, 100% efficient. You could also say, I'm going to be a little nicer. I'm going to just, after you type things in after a second or two, I'm going to just highlight everything. So the current numbers don't go away, because you may need to actually look at these for a few minutes and enter them in your lab book or something, or write them down. But if you then start typing again, because the text is highlighted in my left box, it's going to disappear without me doing anything else. Right? That's another way of creating 100% character efficiency without actually removing the result early on from the user's view. Okay, so these are all detailed interaction choices that you can make, and character efficiency, or in general interaction efficiency, isn't the only way to judge a user interface's quality, right? For sure, it's not, but it's one way to look at it, and especially for things that need to happen a lot, where people need to be very efficient in entering things, it's definitely worth looking at, so that you don't create unnecessary clicks or type or character types that people need to do. So we're trying to really, whittle down everything that is an unnecessary mouse click or keyboard press in this approach. So let's look at the the different entries that we can have here if we have different likelihood, because I said we would actually have 75% positive numbers and 25% negative numbers, right? So with a simple approach, we could say we've got 12 symbols, the minus, the decimal point, and the 10 digits, and they're all equally likely. That's how we've dealt with it so far. So then the probability of each of those is 1/12. So with 4 characters, we get 4 times log 12, which is 14, as the sort of information capacity of these 12 symbols. That's assuming basically I have a keyboard that only has these 12 things on there, and those are the 12 choices that I have. So this would basically mean typing on this would give me, with 4 characters, 4 times log 12. But if we look at what we are typing, here we have a couple of examples what can come up, right? We've got the negative numbers, and negative numbers, because our assumption is that we always type in 4 characters, negative numbers cannot have 3 digits, right? We always say we always have a decimal point. That was an assumption, so the decimal point is always there. So the negative numbers can really only be those ones that are 12.5% likely each, because we said negative numbers are 25% likely overall. And so we distribute that between those 2 examples. And the positive ones need to make up for 75% of the cases. And the positive ones can actually have 3 formats, because we say there is always a decimal point. There is 2 digits and a decimal point, and then after that 1 digit, or the decimal point is after the first digit, or the decimal point is before the first digit, and it's basically a 0 point something, right? Those are the possible formats that can come out based on the assumptions that we've made. 75% positive numbers, 25% negative numbers, always a decimal point, length is always 4 characters. The number of different, and now it gets into how many different values can each of these represent. Those that only have 2 Ds can only represent 100 different values, right? Because it can go from 00 to 99, right? those that have 3 decimal digits in there can actually represent 1,000 values each. Also kind of clear, right? Now, next up, we can say, what then is the likelihood of these to appear? Well, we know that already because we have 12.5% probability of this overall distributed over 100 values gives me a likelihood of 0.00125. On the other hand, if, same thing here with these ones. On the other hand, if I have, for example, the third row here, that's 25% likelihood for this case to happen, distributed over 1,000 different values, means that each individual value now only has a likelihood of 0.00025. And so on, right? Similarly for these others. So now we know the likelihood of each individual combination of digits, minus sign, and decimal point that could possibly be entered across these 4 characters. And we can see now that our initial simple approach of assuming that each of these are all equally likely isn't actually quite true. Right? Some of these combinations will be more likely and others will be less likely. So in the way, because we assumed 25% negative, we kind of gave these shorter entries here a higher likelihood per individual entry. Now we can convert this into bits, because the information per alternative, as per the slide that I just showed you a few minutes ago, is the likelihood of that alternatives times the logarithm of 1 divided through that likelihood. And that gives us the following values for bits here for each of these individual choices, right? Each individual digit and sign and decimal point combination has this much information in bits. And now we can add this back up and say, all right, this first row, for example, every single value of here has a information of 0.012 bits. If I add up, there's 100 different values of these. So overall, these give me 1.2 bits information as a whole. Similarly for the next row, whereas these others are 1,000 times, have 1,000 different values, but have 0.003 information in bits. And so that adds up 1,000 times 0.003, that's 3 bits. Okay. And only by doing this sort of kind of convoluted calculation, you can actually get to these numbers, right? By breaking it down into how likely is every single individual input sequence and how much information in bits does that therefore convey. And then adding things back up. So the the minimum information that is required for the task, we've now actually whittled down to be 11.4 bits per message. Notice this is less than what we said would be the naive approach of just saying we have 12 different symbols, digits 0 to 9 and the decimal point and the minus sign, and we just assume they're all equally likely, and therefore with these 12 different values that we have, we can store a value of 12 different, we can store something that has 12 different values in log 2 of 12 bits, right? Which is roughly, what would be 14 divided by 4, right? So 3.5. What you can see here is the following is happening. If you do a simple approach and just say everything is equally likely, then it's very easy to get to an estimate of what your lower boundary is of information that is being conveyed through this interface, or that needs to be conveyed. But your boundary is actually not the lowest one possible, right? If you actually look at the likelihood, and the likelihoods of different values are not equally distributed, that actually lowers the information content that is provided by this input, and therefore brings down the lower theoretical barrier even further, right? So that's what this tells us about the actual information content in here. And so now we can say, well, how do we actually enter this data? I now know that information efficiency, we said, is being computed by the theoretical minimum, which we've now determined for our setting is 11.4 bits, divided by the information that the user supplies. And if a keyboard has 128 keys, and you assume each of these is equally likely to be used, then each key would just represent log2 of 128, 7 bits of information, right? If somebody randomly hacked at keys on a keyboard, that information channel with 128 keys, which is roughly the number of a keyboard, standard keyboard, extended keyboard, would roughly be log2 of 128, so 7 bits. But in practice, of course, frequency of use varies a lot, right? For example, space is pressed a lot, the E key is pressed a lot, the backslashes may be rarer unless you're unless you write LaTeX. And so in practice, in common, in most applications, the information that is provided per keystroke, because of this uneven definition, is closer to about 5 bits. And our requirement said that the average length of input that we specify the temperature with was 4 keystrokes, right? So in this case, we can now say, if we have 128 keys on a standard keyboard with 5 bits per key, because it's not 7 bits because people don't use all these keys equally likely, then we have 11.4 bits, which is the minimum of information that we need to provide, divided by 5 bits times 4, because we're pressing 4 times, we're pressing a key, right, to enter our message. That would mean that our input efficiency is now 55%. What does that mean? Well, that tells you that this keyboard is offering us way too much choice. And because this also includes the option of pressing wrong keys, our efficiency is actually down, right? We're giving people not the optimum interface. What's the optimal interface for this? Well, if you removed the whole, this whole alphabetical keyboard here and only left people with this numerical keyboard here on the side, where you only have the minus, plus, enter, and then the keys 0 to 9 and a few other operators here. This thing has, as you can see, typically 16 keys. And that would bring it down, or would bring efficiency up to 11.4 bits of theoretical content that needs to be provided, divided by 4 times 4. That's already 70%, right? So we're getting, because we're bringing down the number under the fraction, we're bringing down the information that I'm providing compared to the information that I need to provide. We're whittling away unnecessary interaction. And unnecessary interaction is not just if I need to press more keys than necessary, but it's also if I need to pick these keys from a larger keyboard than necessary for the task. You can think about this intuitively as if you only had this numeric keypad with these few keys on it, each of these keys gets much more use, right? So it's more effective in use. You're less likely to hit a wrong key, and you spend less time finding the right keys because there are fewer available for you to pick from. And then if you were to actually build a dedicated keypad that didn't have a plus key, didn't have a an asterisk and a slash on it, that and no rub out or delete key, you really only provide the keys that you need, which is 0 to 9 and the decimal key and the minus sign, because we said we don't need to actually enter the C or the F anymore. That's not part of the minimum amount of information that needs to be provided. Then you actually end up with an interface with a 12 keys dedicated keypad that would be 4 times 3.6, roughly at 80%. Okay, so what can we do with this? Should you always try to go towards 100% efficiency? No, right? It's an ideal that you can aim for, like the amount of energy that's in like a liter of gasoline, right? You want a motor to be as close to 100% as possible. You'll never build one with 100% efficiency, of course, but you should aim high. Also, it's super important to understand that information theoretic efficiency is not the only goal to strive for, right? To optimize for. There is learnability, discoverability for first-time users, joy of use, all these kinds of things. I just want you to keep this information theoretic efficiency in mind as one way to characterize a user interface that you can examine, that you can calculate with, that you can measure, and that you can factor into your design decisions. You know, if you don't optimize for this, there will have to be other reasons for what you're optimizing instead. And in reality, your designs will always be, of course, sort of a compromise between this goal and many other goals. All right, to conclude, we've looked at evaluation now. We've talked about when you evaluate, all the time in your cycle, why you do it. There's lots of different reasons of what you want to find out, discover unexpected uses, find bugs in your design, etc., determine if how good your design is, and get feedback on your in each iteration. We've talked about you can do this in a lab or in the field, and we've talked about lots of techniques, 10 different techniques that we've covered that work without users when you don't have access to users, or when you want to do a quick and dirty thing without getting a user study set up, and then with users. And we tend to do with user studies, or without user evaluation often happens only in the very early stages of a project. The methods that we've looked at include things that are qualitative and quantitative when you work with users. Quantitative is its own sort of special beast because you need to run controlled experiments and they're involved. They need you to understand statistics and do good design. And this is also the most likely one that you do in research, right? So industry will most often do a think aloud or maybe retrospective testing, something like this. Whereas a heuristic evaluation is also quite likely to happen in an industry setting. And you will more often see in research papers, people do, of course, more of a literature review. They may do more of a modeling because that's an interesting, intellectual exercise to do, and they will do lots of controlled experiments to prove there are things beyond reasonable doubt. And finally, we've talked a bit about how to deal with users and to make sure not to waste their time and treat them with respect because they're dedicating, volunteering their time for your work. That concludes today's class. Thanks very much for listening and sticking with us and participating. Take your little temperature converter and do a quick analysis on how fast you were and how much you were able to whittle down the interaction and maybe to see how efficient you are. You can do a little GOMS KLM thing with it and just add up the number of seconds that you need and see how good you're doing there. Or you can also analyze it with the information theoretic efficiency goals that we've looked at here in the last couple of slides. Thanks, everybody, and I'll see you again next time.
This content was provided by RWTH Aachen University.